watching for that. Now I'd like to bring in my colleague Jen Psaki, host of The Briefing with Jen Psaki and former press secretary to President Joe Biden. You kind of know this dynamic from both sides. You're someone who has been on sort of both sides of what can be a fraught dynamic, is always sort of weird and complicated, and I think psychologically strange. Like, what is that relationship? And it's adversarial, but you're human beings. You're spending time together. The things that Michael Isikoff was saying were true. It's sort of natural. And yet we're in a completely different world now. And there's something strange about the juxtaposition of how different the world is and the room looking the same way, if I can say that, right? That's kind of odd about this moment.
No question about it. I mean, I will say, not to make it less sexy than people make it seem, but most of the time, the source in the room is like the staff director for the budget committee who's sitting next to a reporter,
right, yeah.
an economics reporter from the Washington Post, and they're talking about the budget negotiations, and that informs the reporting. That's most of the time. And the vast majority of reporters in that room most of the time are not people who are easily swayed by people just because they had rubber chicken next to each other at a dinner. But yes, we're in a very different time right now. And as everybody has outlined through the course of your show, I mean, this is a president who has taken on the press, attacked the rights of the freedom of press, the right to free speech, more than anyone else with every lever of his power. And now he's standing in this room and not standing currently. His eyelids are looking a little heavy, might I note. But, you know, he's going to be standing in this room and delivering a speech to this group of people. The one thing I will say that I have noted, and I'd be interested if you agree or not, I mean, is a year and a half ago, in the beginning of this administration, it was, I mean, we could do a story every single day about how the press were acquiescing, how major news organizations were acquiescing to the Trump administration. From the Barry Weiss era, which we're still in, to ABC, to Jimmy Kimmel period of time. I do think we're seeing more pushback from news organizations punching back, including the New York Times and others. That's important to see. Are there exceptions to that? Is it enough? No, but it is a change in guard, and a lot of those people are in the room tonight for that, too.
I completely agree. I think that's true. I think that's true surveying the entire landscape of civic institutions in a free society, right? So, like, the law and the law firms and the universities and the press, right? There's all these things. There's like, you know, what makes up an open society? There's all these, there's the government, there's businesses, right? And then there's this whole landscape that is all things that aren't one of those two things. And that's religious organizations, and it's political parties, it's community organizations, and yes, I totally agree. I think, you know, the media is one of the tent poles of that, but I think we have seen people get tougher. And honestly, you know, the irony here is, for all the manipulation and browbeating of the press, for all the attempts to kind of control it through regulatory fiat, the guy's polling at 34% this week. So this has not been, if the idea is we will control the press and our buddy Elon Musk owns Twitter and our other buddy's going to buy this, and that's going to allow us to propagandize the American people who are going to love us, like, that is plainly not working right now.
It's not working. I mean, I also think, and you talked about the journalists who are going to get awards tonight, and as we watch that, because I've sat through this many of times, people should know that typically what happens is those awards are given out, and then everybody on the dais, including the president, shakes the hand and congratulates the reporters who get the award. So we can watch for that and see if that happens. But Tyler Pager, the story, I mean, who you probably know. I mean, he's 31, 32 years old. He was a well-meaning, good reporter, thorn in my side when I was the White House press secretary because of his relentlessness in covering the Biden administration. Now he's getting an award for his reporting on the Trump administration, things like how much the donations of Timothy Mellon to K for Troops, right? The behind-the-scenes story behind the Zelensky-Trump meeting. These are things the public wants to know about, right? And he was also a reporter who received a subpoena just 2 weeks ago. And guess what he did today? He reported another story about the Qatari jet. Point is, like, I'm not sure a lot of these people are not exactly cowing to Trump's efforts here. And we see that in evidence, right?
Yeah, we've also reached, we should just note, we've reached the eye resting portion of the evening. Sometimes, you know, if you're standing for a long time, you get tired, you sit down, you rest your legs. Donald Trump's eyelids are like everyone else's legs. If they're open for too long, they get a little fatigued, and he needs to rest them. Now, I will say, I can't imagine something more boring to Donald Trump than people giving speeches about like the First Amendment and the power of the press and talking about things other than Donald Trump. So we're not surprisingly seeing him check out a bit. I do wonder too, like, you know, the ownership structure part of this, right, is interesting because that was the other thing that we saw early on was, you know, take Disney, for example, right? Disney settles that George Stephanopoulos lawsuit, which I think was a bad suit. You know, I don't have eyes into the internal deliberations out of it. I think it was a bad suit. They settled it. I think it set a bad mark. And Trump sort of lords it over them, right? And I think Disney was scared at some level about reprisal from a government that they need regulatory things from. That part of it at the highest echelons and levels also seems to be subsiding a little. Like clearly that's still in the case with the Time Warner acquisition, with Paramount, stuff like that. But again, more fight, other parties now getting involved in trying to block that acquisition. Disney, the second time around, just kind of like not taking Kimmel off the air and kind of brushing it off. Like there is a lot of that, even at the highest level.
That is true, even at the highest levels and big corporate levels. Not all of them, but certainly Disney's a good example. I also think we've seen, I mean, Sarah Fitzpatrick's story about Kash Patel from several weeks ago that The Atlantic put out, that he threatened to sue them, right? Then Jeffrey Goldberg came out with a scathing response, and Sarah Fitzpatrick did another story about it. So even news organizations that aren't as enormous, that don't have the resources of an enormous corporate entity are also like, you know what? Bully trying to take my lunch money, I'm not going to give you my lunch money because otherwise you're going to come back and ask for my lunch money again. And that's a good sign.
Josh Dawsey, I believe, getting an award up there, a great reporter for the Wall Street Journal. I do feel duty bound to note as we talk how weird it would be if I just went like this while you're talking to me. Like it would be strange. People would remark on it. It's become something that just happens all the time. But obviously, if anyone else did that, or if you were in a meeting or you're in the middle of an interview and someone did that, it would be notable. You would remark on it.
It would be notable, Chris, that we've sat on panels for hours and hours together watching a variety of events that could be described as not exactly earth-shatteringly exciting at all moments. And neither of us have closed our eyes that I recall. But yes, that appears to be what's happening right now, what we're watching, though clapping aggressively.
What do you think about this sort of question about, you know, you talk to reporters. I mean, I think you and I are in a different position. You know, we're sort of on networks and have shows that have sort of our names and our voices, and people are sort of watching us. It's like we're telling you what we think, right? That's the bargain we have with the viewer, right? I'm going to tell you what I actually think. That's not true for a ton of people in the press, and many people in the press are, you know, the sort of norms around what they're doing is they're not telling what they think. They're sort of reporting the facts. They're letting the story speak for itself. And there's a feeling that Donald Trump wants to kind of go with war with the press to make them the enemy, because he wants to kind of make them seem politically toxic to the 40% of the country that sort of he has a lock on, or the 38 or 34%. And that the press does itself a disservice if they seem to be playing into going to war with him. That's one argument. The argument on the other side is it's kind of crazy when a person's going to war against you to sort of pretend like he isn't. And to kind of keep conducting business as normal. And again, I think there's sort of arguments on both sides. I think there are people with good faith and really people I respect who are in different parts of that debate, depending on where they're in the landscape. But what do you think about that debate?
I mean, I think Trump is a dog that doesn't have very many new tricks, right? And so he has long thought that if he bullies the press, they're going to acquiesce. And for a period of time, a number of organizations did, and in a relatively recently. That has been changing to some degree, as we've been talking about. One of the things I think is interesting in terms of how we talked about it in the Oval Office today is he kind of suggested, I'm not going, and he said this recently, I'm not going after the press. I'm going after the people internally. The press are just a means of getting there. And this is also their argument around the lawsuits, right? And sweeping up journalists in that. I think that's total BS, but it's almost like he's changing his own spin to try to say, because maybe he recognizes he's losing this a bit.
Well, let's just say, end on this note. no one is more obsessed with the press and kind of loves the press in a weird fetishistic way than Donald Trump, who is like has been a press hound his entire life, has been called people up with a fake name John Barron to work them, was constantly at tabloids, like loves reading about himself. Like no one has a more dysfunctionally obsessive fetishistic focus on media, press coverage, than the individual on your screen right there. Like this is someone who cares more than anyone ever should care, frankly, about stuff. So, yes.
He wants to be loved so much, you know, and I always think, Chris, about when he met with Barack Obama in the Oval Office right after he got elected in 2016, and he kept asking him, how are you so popular? Not about a lot of other things that you might want to know if you're an incoming president.
Right.
Because he wants to be loved. Right? That's it.
How do the nuclear codes work?
450,000.
Okay, in case you've had enough for this moment, we're going to break in for a moment. This felt so far to me like one of those awkward wedding speeches where the bride's father thinks he's funnier than he is and goes on way too long telling stories. I mean, I have been to countless White House Correspondents' dinners. I have worked for 2 presidents who have spoken at these dinners. And it's always stressful to come up with funny jokes, but here we are. Now, the backdrop, again, we've been talking about this, but the backdrop of tonight's speech was not just that this is a man who is at somewhere between 30 and 32 or 33% in recent polls for overall approval rating. It's a man who has spent his presidency attacking, threatening, and suing the very media organizations who are in the room as he is speaking tonight, which I think we all have to talk about and acknowledge. And as for the speech itself, and if you've been listening, you've heard from a lot of this, but just in case you're tuning in now or you're just trying to make sense of what's happening, he spent a good chunk of time talking about his favorite topic of all time, surprise, surprise, his job as an interior decorator, musing about the chandeliers in the Palm Room and new windows, everyone. We're in the middle of a war, but new windows and the chandelier. And, of course, about his second favorite job as White House events coordinator, from the recent fight on the White House lawn, that was quite a horror show that we all saw, to plans for the future and his events he's planning in the future. He also talked in detail about the last Correspondents' dinner and threats on his life in gory detail at some point. He talked about the changes David Ellison might make, maybe joked about the name of the Correspondents' dinner being changed, joked about maybe a third term, which he said he was joking, but who knows. And also for a man who looked like he had very, very heavy eyelids for the majority of the night, and that is being very diplomatic. He felt like this was the moment to make an age joke about Joe Biden, of all people. So there is that, maybe not a big room reader. The closest thing he came to an actual joke was a riff about RFK's love of dead animals, and maybe a little bit in the beginning, but maybe there's more jokes to come. We're going to dip back in a moment, but first let's just get back to some of my friends here who are at this table who have been to a lot of these dinners, aren't holding back on their thoughts of it. Of course, Terry Moran and Eugene Daniels. Terry, you said something funny, which is there's always a tell with presidents, right?
There is.
And with Trump, there's one when he says, sir, and he's telling a story, right?
And they said to me, sir, and you know that what he will say next is not true. That is his signal. And they said, sir, and then you know whatever he says the guy said, the guy didn't say. That said, I think he's on his best behavior in some ways. You know, he's not ranting at the press. And once again, I think that's evidence, whatever his poll numbers, he's in charge. And I don't think he thinks he's going to lose power. He's going to, whatever happens in the midterms, he's going to attack the results if they don't go his way. And I think he's riding as high as he can. He's a megalomaniac now filled with authority, and he is making his mark on the country. Physically, legally, morally, in every way, there will be an age of Trump that will be remembered. I'm sure that's the way he thinks about it.
Well, see, I have a very opposite view on this. I think he feels quite weak inside and under threat because of his poll numbers and because he can read a poll and sees what's happening out in the country and knows that if there's a take back of even part of Congress, that there's going to be a lot of attention paid to his administration, and it's not going to be as easy for him to avoid scrutiny, and that's part of it. And yes, he will certainly do everything you said.
He'll attack the elections, and I think he's got a plan to prevent anyone taking power.
But that's a sign, I think, of feeling weak, not feeling strong.
Possibly. So you think his niceness is insecurity?
Yeah, I think
he desperately wants to be liked. Donald Trump is not that complicated. For those who have read Regime Change by Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan, the best lesson I took as a reporter covering this world of Trump is that he is very simple in what he wants, and he wants desperately to be liked. In her first book, Confidence Man, I feel like Maggie Haberman's agent, but she talked about how he was always someone who wanted to be seen as a Manhattan person who was important and who was a mover and a shaker. So he knows the people in that room do have a kind of power, right? They do have a kind of influence. So he's constantly kind of auditioning to you. When you meet Donald Trump and you talk to him, he's selling himself to you, right? And that's why he makes the jokes. He is a little bit self-deprecating. And I think at the end of the day, he can be as self-deprecating as he wants. He can make as many jokes about Bobby Kennedy as he wants. At the end of the day, the reason it's not funny is because Donald Trump has kicked the Associated Press out of the pool. He has taken over the pool. They have subpoenaed journalists. They have knocked on their doors and taken things for doing their jobs. So he can act as if this is normal, right? He's gonna keep going, and he might be ranting about the press at this point, but he's ranting and raving, right? He is off topic, 8 minutes almost, talking about a ballroom that the White House Correspondents' Dinner will actually never be at, right? Has nothing to do with anything. Talking about the fact that folks are gonna be driving around down Pennsylvania Avenue and another one of these sporting events.
Part of his event planning.
Exactly. And so like all of those things are making me feel like he just knows one thing, and it's rally speech. That's what I'm getting out of this, is a rally speech. He's not doing the thing that he is supposed to be doing. He isn't looking at the teleprompter right now, which tells me that he's also off script. I don't even have to hear what he's saying. And I think at the end of the day, Donald Trump can make as many jokes as he wants, but the thing that is not funny is what he's doing in attacking the free press.
It's interesting because it kind of feels, and one of our producers said this to me, it feels a little bit like he's got some jokes, and then in between he's sort of telling stories that he's told many times before, some with like kind of new edge to them. Let's talk about, and we'll dip back in, we'll watch it and see what's happening here. Let's talk about what could happen after. Let's say post-Trump, Trump will not be president forever. Do you think, what does that reset look like with the White House and government officials? You alluded to this a little bit earlier, and the press. I mean, hopefully you don't have a president who's obviously attacking them and issuing subpoenas all the time and suing them and threatening them. Let's put that aside. What does that look like in a healthy relationship? Because I think sometimes we forget that. Yeah,
I don't think we can go back to the Washington of the 1950s or even the Washington of the 2010s. Mm-hmm. He's changed it. He has changed Washington. He's changed the country. And so I think future presidents, both Republican and Democratic, will take some of the power that he got to trash the press, right? For a long time, there was a kind of understanding that the president was the president. There was a point at which you could go in reporting on him and in calling him out. You couldn't get personal with him. And Trump comes in that first term, and he's breaking all the norms, mostly, though, not with the power, but with his personality. And I'm sure he felt attacked. Well, now all of that it's all open field for Trump, for the presidents, and for the press. And the other thing is there's no such thing as the press anymore. So as candidates are doing every day, they're finding ways around the press that they don't like. They're finding the press that might help them and focusing on that. And that will create, a less reliable narrative out of Washington.
Well, everybody has become a content creator, right? Including candidates.
Yes.
Yeah, independent media as well, but including candidates themselves, which has massively changed how communications is done out of the White House, and I think it will certainly change future White Houses. Eugene, what about you? I mean, I think that the age-old days of like the White House Correspondents Association, put the dinner aside for a second, which I think there's lots of important debates about, but sending a letter, a sternly worded letter to the White House press secretary and demanding access to something, it's like those days are over. I mean, those weren't even taken that seriously when I was in the Biden administration. But what does that look like? And to Terry's point, I mean, the press has expanded massively. So it's like the association is a very different entity. And also it should change because it's all about communicating with the public. How does it change?
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's morphing in a certain way. There are independent journalists who are good actors, right? People who are formerly at news organizations who are now, doing their own thing, like Terry here. There are people who maybe have a slant to what they're doing, and so they're doing some more opinion journalist type things. That's all well and good, but there's also really bad actors. And I think that is the issue that we have here, right? Is like there's a whole ecosystem that is out there that wants to spread misinformation and disinformation. And that's the thing that I think we as the press, all of us, whoever it is, and how the American people see us are going to have to figure out how to weed out that aspect of it. It's going to be really difficult because people can pick and choose where they want to go. I think at the end of the day, we have learned a lot of lessons, I hope, out of the second Trump presidency, which is, you know, as much as when you would say something from the podium, I always took it as Jen is saying what she knows to be true at the time, right? And then my job after that is to verify if someone told you all the information, right? That was part of the job. But now we can't, the trust but verify does not exist anymore with this administration and possibly with future administrations, because they are learning lessons and watching what blowback happens to presidents. What are the things that they can get away with when they are in the White House moving on, whether they be definitely Republican and possibly even Democrat. What are the ways in which I can do things and no one's going to care? And I think that aspect of it is something that the country is going to have to contend with, and it's going to be really difficult to do so.
But nothing stays the same, including the disruption. Time is a great healer, and I think we're going to have to rely on the fact that the world is made of facts. For example, in this war, they can't find a way out with their usual media and their friendly media, their subservient media. They can't find a way out with lies because it's very difficult to lie about what's happening in the Middle East, not just the deaths of Americans, but the huge shift in the power structure of the Middle East with the United States going down. Those are things you can't really argue with. So I've always thought that people will want to read the news that flatters their prejudices until they walk into a brick wall. And they're going to say, most of them are going to say, ouch.
Or they're watching all the money leave their accounts, right? We have a lot of great colleagues, Alex Tabbitt, Namdi, they're going out and talking to people at gas stations, showing them what Donald Trump is saying, and people who have voted for him 3 times who are saying, this is not okay. He needs to get his act together. He needs to focus. He promised us something, and he is not making good on that promise. So the politics are still there. And I think when people you cannot convince people, and the Biden administration found this out, you cannot convince people that what they're spending is not true. You can't will that away.
I just want to talk about one of the most awkward moments of this dinner so far, but it perfectly exposed exactly who Donald Trump is, as if we needed more evidence. We've all been talking about this. It happened when the White House Correspondents Association awarded the Katharine Graham Award for Courage and Accountability to the 2 Wall Street Journal reporters who broke the biggest story of 2025. Jeffrey Epstein's friends sent him body letters for a 50th birthday album. One was from Donald Trump. That was the headline of that story. Now, the exclusive reporting noted that the 2003 birthday book was compiled by Ghislaine Maxwell, now serving time in federal prison after being convicted of sex trafficking minors. It reported on the extremely weird letter from Trump to Epstein saying, quote, it contains several lines of typewritten text framed by the outline of a naked woman, which appears to be hand-drawn with a heavy marker. A pair of small arcs denotes the woman's breast, and the future president's signature is a squiggly Donald below her waist, mimicking pubic hair. Inside the outline of the naked woman was a typewritten note styled as an imaginary conversation between Trump and Epstein, written in the third person. A conversation that had Donald Trump saying to Jeffrey Epstein, may every day be another wonderful secret. Now, Trump claimed the letter was fake and sued the Wall Street Journal. That lawsuit was tossed once already, but Trump is suing the Journal again. And once again, the Wall Street Journal has asked for a dismissal. Reporters Khadija Safdar and Joe Palazzolo broke that story. They were honored along with 6 of their colleagues who reported on the fallout inside the White House. Wolf Blitzer, giving out the award, noted that Khadija Safdar's family had to be relocated due to safety concerns after that story because Donald Trump's lawsuit exposed her home address. Just to give you just a sense of the threats people are facing. And Trump smirked. He smirked and he shrugged. I wanted you to remind you of all the backstory, but watch it for yourself.
The Katharine Graham Award for Courage and Accountability, named for the legendary Washington Post publisher, and it comes with a prize of $10,000. This year's award goes to the Wall Street Journal. The Journal's courageous reporting on President Trump's past relationship with financier Jeffrey Epstein triggered the release of the so-called Epstein files, thousands of documents that might otherwise have remained hidden from the public. And despite the president's threat of a lawsuit, the Journal published a story about a provocative letter to Epstein bearing President Trump's signature. Trump quickly filed a $20 billion lawsuit against the Journal, revealing reporter Khadija Safdar's home address. Her family had to be relocated. The Journal was kicked off of Air Force One, but the reporters continue to file revelatory stories. Please welcome the winners of the Katharine Graham Award from the Wall Street Journal. Khadija Safdar, Sadie Gurman, Annie Linsky, Josh Dawsey again, Alex Leary, Rebecca Ballhaus, and Ryan Barber. Their colleague, Joe Palazzolo, could not attend tonight.
Okay, despite Donald Trump, as we just showed you, smirking as Wolf Blitzer was reading the detail about Khadija Safdar's home address being released and her family having to be relocated, he literally smirked during that moment, which we had not seen before. I had not seen before. We'd only seen the shaking of the hands. But despite that, she still shook his hand. She can take professional satisfaction in the fact that everything that was just said in that commendation about her reporting was true, because she and her colleagues who broke that news last July set off a race by Democrats on the Oversight Committee, spearheaded by our next guest, Ro Khanna, to obtain the birthday book with that creepy card Donald Trump claims he did not write from the Epstein estate, which they did in early September. And by November, the Epstein Files Transparency Act had become law, with strong bipartisan support, including a unanimous vote in the Senate, forcing Donald Trump to sign it and the Epstein files to be released, which in the hands of Donald Trump's DOJ and Attorney General nominee Todd Blanche is where the momentum has stalled. That is where we are. But the origin of this is definitely rooted in that story a lot. Joining us now is California Congressman Ro Khanna, a member of the House Oversight Committee. First of all, given how steeped you have been in trying to get justice for these survivors and pushing the administration for information, as you watched that moment of Donald Trump smirking, what went through your head?
These journalists made history. Donald Trump can't take that away from them. We would never have had the momentum to subpoena the Epstein estate if it wasn't for their reporting. The Epstein Files Act would never have passed if it weren't for their reporting. They put the survivors front and center. They gave us the idea of subpoenaing the estate. Look, they basically started the unraveling of the Trump presidency. So he can smirk, but he's at 32% and has lost even his MAGA base on this issue.
Yeah, he has. It's interesting. Places where he once was in much stronger footing. This is one of them. The economy is another one. Immigration is another one. It's, all of this, I've been talking about the backdrops of this speech today because I think it's important to remind people of. And one of them is the hurdle to Todd Blanche's confirmation for Attorney General. There should be a lot of hurdles. There are a lot of hurdles. I mean, there's 2 senators who are the hurdles currently. But this should be one of the hurdles. I mean, given how the Department of Justice under his leadership has really failed to comply here. Give us a sense. We talk about this a lot, but again, this is an opportunity and a moment to remind people of how difficult they've been in implementing and working with, really, on this.
Jen, when we started this, it was nothing to do with Donald Trump. We were working with Marjorie Taylor Greene and Nancy Mace. It was all about the survivors. And they thought, certainly, Donald Trump, who had campaigned on releasing the Epstein files, would release the Epstein files. But while there have been prosecutions around the world, former princes, former prime ministers, former ambassadors, there has not been a single investigation or prosecution here in the United States, even though in those files are the names of people who survivors will tell you raped them, abused them, trafficked them. This is not exaggeration. These survivors are saying that not a single investigation, and they still have 3 million files that they haven't released, even though a federal judge, because of Katie Fang's effort, has found that that's in violation of the Epstein Transparency Act. And the person most responsible, other than Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, is Todd Blanche. And he's coming and he's asking the American people to put him as Attorney General. That would be a slap in the face of the survivors, and it would be the slap in the face of the democratic process.
Let me ask you we've been talking about this a little bit, like why Donald Trump is at this dinner, what is going on inside his head right now. I mean, I think the man is in the low 30s in polling. If you look across the country, he's at 28% in a recent poll on the economy. He's underwater on all sorts of issues. He wants people to like him. What do you think this is all about tonight?
I think it's self-indulgent. I mean, I was in the green room hearing him go on and on and on about this wrestling match and ultimate fighting match in the White House. And it's just someone rambling. You know, it's someone who understands he's unpopular, who understands he's kind of towards the end of his career. And he's almost like fighting to be relevant, fighting to still have the stage, seeing it slip away from him. You know, even The Apprentice only ran 13 years. 13 years, you know, Trump is approaching a time where he's become a bore. More than a fascist or something, you can't be a bore in America. And his act is no longer connecting. And I think he gets that. I think he understands that. He's desperate to be the center of attention. I mean, you know this. He will trash the press, but he'll court the press. He's desperate to be written about, and he'll call bookers. I mean, he'll call bookers to get on TV himself. And so he sees himself slipping from center stage.
We're just over, as I think everybody watching knows, 3 months from an election. If Democrats win back the House, which certainly they seem very well positioned to do, maybe even the Senate, what does that look like in terms of what can happen on further pressing to implement this law that the Department of Justice is refusing to do?
First of all, the Democrats are more unified, more energized than I've ever seen us. And you see that energy every week in the Hakeem's leadership meetings. But we will require and demand the full release of the files. We will have criminal referrals under Robert Garcia's leadership on oversight of people who should face prosecution. We will actually have the survivors come and testify. Can you imagine? They have not had the survivors testify to the American public. So we will get transparency here. But we're also going to have a day one agenda. Hakeem talks about first 100 days, first 100 hours, where we're going to actually start tackling child care costs, health care costs, cost of living. It's going to be an ambitious agenda to turn things around and improve people's lives. And people are seeing it. That's why they have started to trust Democrats more on the economy.
One of the topics that you talk about a lot but doesn't get nearly enough attention is, of course, Ghislaine Maxwell's status. And Todd Blanche has been, obviously you're in the House, not the Senate, but in these hearings, I mean, he's been completely disingenuous in answering questions on that topic, as he has been in general. Where does that all stand? What should people understand about the big questions? It's obviously her prison transfer is a big question. Why Todd Blanche was the one interviewing her. What else is on your mind at this point in time?
Our oversight committee, in a bipartisan way, went down to see where she was in prison, and they described it as being on a college campus. I mean, she's getting the most lenient treatment, where she gets hours to exercise and basically the easiest and best accommodations. Now, why does this matter? When you talk to the survivors, they're as angry at Ghislaine Maxwell as they are on Epstein. They view her as someone who abused them, who facilitated that abuse. And to see someone like that not have repercussions, it drives people crazy. It's this elite impunity, this sense that there's a different set of laws for people if you know the president, if you know the president's lawyers. And it gets at this sense of unfairness in the system. Trump ran against all of this. He said, I'm going to actually blow up a system that's not working for you. And he's become part of that system.
As Donald Trump does his best to denigrate the press tonight in what is now past, I believe, or coming close to passing the hour mark, I think it's important to remember just how important he himself has made the press, even when it comes to just understanding basic facts. I mean, earlier this week, Trump attended the dignified transfer of 4 U.S. service members who were killed in the war with Iran. They brought the total death toll of U.S. service members killed in Trump's war to 18. But the day after that dignified transfer, the website the Pentagon reports casualties on had lowered that number to just 14. On Wednesday, it said 18 people had been killed in this war. By Thursday, it said 14. Now, the Pentagon's acting press secretary attributed the change to just a temporary data disruption and suggested that it would be quickly fixed. As of tonight, those numbers still do not appear to have been fixed. And now, if we don't have a robust press corps, we probably wouldn't know about the story to begin with. But we certainly wouldn't know this because the 3 military officials told the New York Times that one of the reasons the death toll got lower was because the Trump administration decided to remove 4 service members killed this past weekend from the list because their deaths occurred after Trump declared a ceasefire in the war in April. Think about that. 4 U.S. service members were killed because of Trump's war of choice. But the administration has reportedly decided not to count their deaths in the war's official death toll. I mean, it is giving me... It's infuriating. It's also giving me flashbacks to the beginning of the COVID when the number of people testing positive for the virus was making Trump look bad. So Trump's solution was to try to get everyone to stop testing. Over and over again, he has tried to hide the truth rather than face it. But luckily, the press corps hasn't let him get away with it. And I think there's increasing pushback, as we've been talking about. Joining me now to talk about this longtime and legendary Pentagon correspondent Barbara Starr and retired Lieutenant General Mark Hertling. Thank you both so much for being here. Barbara, let me start with you. I mean, you have covered the Pentagon for decades. How unusual is it to see something as basic as the official number of American troops killed in a war suddenly changed, and then hearing conflicting explanations from the Pentagon and military officials about why it happened?
Well, it's the conflicting explanations that really are so disgraceful. A data problem, a problem with the database. If there was a problem with a DOD database about soldiers, troops killed in action, and the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, wanted it fixed so that the database would be accurate, all he has to do is call his aide in and say, get this fixed and get it fixed now, and it would be. And by all accounts, he has not done that. If this is because there was a ceasefire, and, they weren't killed in combat in the war against Iran. What a load of nonsense. And it is General Hertling, I am sure, can tell you much more about this than I can, but I can tell you it is a fundamental pillar of the American military and American life forever that the United States acknowledges its war dead and acknowledges them with full candor. He can move them out of the database, I can tell you. The sacrifices they made will not be forgotten.
No, disgraceful is, I can't think of a better way to describe it. But General Hertling, let me turn to you. If those casualty numbers are being changed, or even if there's confusion about them, what does that mean for the men and women serving, for military leaders, and especially for the families of those service members, and frankly, the families of service members who are now out there fighting in this war that they still don't have an explanation for the purpose of?
Well, Jen, I'll talk about the leaders first. You know, when you're a military commander or any kind of leader, one of your first obligations is to account for your people. Those serving, who are in different places, and especially in combat, those that are wounded, missing, and killed. Long before statistics are compiled back in the Department of Defense, something called a casualty feeder report, the military commanders owe accounting to the families, as you just said, to the force, to their fellow soldiers, and to the nation. None of this is politics, it's military ethics. And the fact that this occurred over the last couple of days, I find reprehensible, because they were initially reported on that casualty feeder that was on the DOD website 2 days ago, and then it suddenly came down. It's been down 2 days. I just checked it just a few minutes ago. And as Barbara just said, if the secretary wanted to fix a glitch, a temporary data disruption, he could do it in a nanosecond. So it hasn't been done. I think we're playing politics, and that leads to a second issue. And it shouldn't be an excuse, but truthfully, it becomes an issue of trust. And trust is a strategic resource, more so than some of the other things we do. Any democracy asks extraordinary things of their young Americans. It asks them to accept unlimited liability, and in return, the government owes complete honesty. And that's where we're falling short right now. There is very little candor about the war. There is very little candor about casualties, equipment losses, damage to bases, and all the other things that, as a commander in combat, and Barbara pointed to me because she visited me in combat a couple of times with her news organization, she saw how draconian we were on certain things. And casualty reporting, not just killed in action, but wounded in action, very seriously injured and not as seriously injured, died of non-battle wounds like accidents or aircraft having damage. All of those things are accounted for, and a commander is responsible for it at every single level.
Barbara, this discrepancy only came to light, I mean, because reporters noticed the numbers as they kind of culled through the data, which is interesting. I mean, you've talked a lot, we've talked before about how even though there's this effort to not do Pentagon briefings, they haven't had one really since early May, if I'm getting my numbers correctly here. The efforts to crack down, the lack of disclosure of information. There is still excellent reporting being done, of course, because there's excellent reporters covering the Pentagon. What do you think this tells us about that and how that's all going?
Well, you know, and again, this is a week when we saw the courts lead the Justice Department to withdraw subpoenas against New York Times reporters as part of an alleged leak investigation. We continue to see the administration go after the media time after time after time. And I have said, and I really believe this, I really do, right from the beginning, you know, for those sitting in the back not paying attention, listen up. The American news media is not going anywhere. It will continue to do its job. It will continue to report on the government, on those who serve, how taxpayer money is spent, and what the government is doing. This still is a democracy. Someday, Pete Hegseth is going to be out of office, and things hopefully they'll change before he leaves. But, you know, the life will move on. And in the meantime, the American news media not going anywhere, continuing to do its job against all of the threats, the intimidation, the accusations, the insults thrown at it by everyone from the president to the Secretary of Defense. It's ridiculous, and it's not going to stop American reporters from reporting on this government.
Let me ask you, just to that point, Lieutenant General Hertling, I mean, there has been obviously a bunch of reporting about this Qatari jet, and we all watched as Trump did not take the plane back. One of the New York Times reporters who reported that story were issued subpoenas. There were subpoenas issued against them. There was a new story today, I should note, new reporting tonight from the New York Times, that Donald Trump abruptly switched from the Qatari-donated Air Force One to the older presidential aircraft while leaving Turkey after U.S. officials judged there to be a credible threat from Iranian proxy forces targeting the president and his plane. We could all see with our eyes, and also from reporting, what the plane may not have been equipped for. But what does that decision tell you about the seriousness of the threat? To the degree you have an assessment of that, what do you make of it?
Well, the Secret Service and the Air Force takes every threat as serious. There are no, hey, this is non-serious, we can risk this, or this is serious and we've got to do something about it. Anytime there is a threat, no matter where it comes from, they address it and they do risk mitigation. So everything, when you're talking about basically taking care of a principal, in this case, the president and everyone else that rides on Air Force One, you take it seriously until you either confirm or deny the threat exists. So, yeah, you can't hedge on this, Jen. They have to do something about it. But again, it was the way the president treated it. When the day that he took the old Air Force One back, and it was announced that he was going to send the new one, the Qatari jet, to England so that soldiers could see it, man, you know, You know, I try not to use profanity when I'm doing military analysis, but the only thing that came to my mind was that's bullshit. I mean, it's obvious that it's BS. The military teaches leaders about both success and failure and how to handle it. They also teach them accountability, accounting, and responsibility, and that's not taking place right now. There's very little candor, and there seems to be a lot of walls being put up to prevent the truth from coming out.
Sometimes you just got to say BS and say the actual words, and I'm here for it. I'm so grateful to you both. Thank you. I mean, the role of reporters and journalists on a night where the president just spoke for over an hour and donned a Trump 2028 hat at the very end is an important part of the story, and there's so much excellent reporting that's still happening. Thank you both so much for being here with me tonight.
Thanks, Jen.
We begin today with round 2 of the White House Correspondents' Dinner 2026 after May's dinner was cut short by that shooting. Trump, who has routinely attacked the press, didn't miss the opportunity to take personal jabs and criticize media coverage of him.
This place is really the largest group of Trump derangement syndrome people ever put together at one time, I suspect. This evening, it's really all about the fake news media and your handling of prizes and writing and producing and performing made-up stories like the Academy Awards. Sometimes I don't feel you treat me fair, or maybe you do. I don't know. I don't feel that, but sometimes you treat me very fairly. And I have a lot of respect for your profession. They said, would you do it next year? I said, I will be back next year. Now, if you get really, really nasty, maybe not. I don't know. But we're going to be back next year.
Yes, that was the President of the United States with the Trump 2028 hat at the White House Correspondents' Dinner last night. He ended his remarks with a so-called joke about seeking a fourth term. He's only been president twice, as president.
This is somewhat of a scoop. My intention to run for a fourth term as President of the United States. I will be doing that. I will be having an official. In fact, I think I have. Yeah. I won 3 times. Now I'm going to do it again. Thank you.
The president's speech comes amid efforts from his administration to threaten press freedoms. It's been happening for 18 months. One day ahead of his remarks, a federal judge placed pressure on Trump's DOJ, causing the department to drop subpoenas it issued to New York Times journalists who reported on security concerns about the new Air Force One, used, as our friend Jonathan Capehart likes to remind us, that was gifted to Trump by the Qatari royal family. Joining us at the table now is Aidan McLaughlin, Vanity Fair Washington correspondent, and MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard, who was in the room last night. Vaughn, as the person who was in the room. Thank you both for coming. Thank you both for coming. But Vaughn, as someone who was in the room, like I watched it on television with Jen as we were doing special coverage last night, and what I took from it was someone who didn't know his audience, right? Mm-hmm. I took from it, usually these speeches are 10 to 20 minutes. I think Biden's longest speech was 20 minutes when he was president. This was an hour long. Right. It was largely a rally speech at the end of the day, right? Like he kept going in and out as he does at rallies. It was also disturbing in a lot of places where the president of the United States made jokes, quote unquote, about seeking a fourth term, which implies that he won in 2020, spreading his election lies. And I'm curious how the things that I saw here watching it, how that played in the room full of journalists who cover this man.
They were crass. They were offensive jokes. And there was an uncomfortability in that room. It was a much smaller ballroom than the initial Washington Hilton ballroom, maybe a fifth of the size. And I think it's important to note, you can hear in the audio some clapping and laughing. I mean, lucky if 10% of the room was laughing or clapping for him at any given time. And that's because essentially the entire cabinet was there. You had other Trump officials in there. You had Trump-aligned media in there. As for the actual journalists, those that cover the White House, those that cover Washington, there was just dead silence as he made mean, cruel jokes about our friend and colleague over at CNN, Caitlin Collins, made a crack at Josh Dorsey, our friend over at the Wall Street Journal, and effectively mocked CBS News and the good journalists that exist inside of that newsroom by continually repeating CBS's David Ellison, his buddy and the owner of Paramount, that is the corporate head of CBS. And
it was how he expects the leaders of news organizations to behave.
It was an acknowledgement that he's picking up the phone and calling the head of the corporation.
Right.
There is supposed to be editorial independence. And inside of there, instead of celebrating what the founders put inside of the Constitution as a right, not a privilege, as a right, in order to hold those officials that are running our government, whether it be at the federal level or the state level or the local level, accountable, he was in there, in that room, effectively mocking, degrading them at the same time that he and his administration and his legal allies have filed numerous millions and billions of dollars of lawsuits and gone and effectively sought even subpoenas of journalists and their family members.
I do think the speech was a very less illuminating window into his psyche and all of the characters that live rent-free in there.
Right.
He also recycled a lot of his normal rally political attacks against the usual suspects, which I don't know if that was actually written by the speechwriter into that speech or if he went off teleprompter. But Aidan, let's listen to some of these attacks he lodged, not just against journalists, but his political foes.
He turned Palestinian. This was a man who was 100% for Israel. 100%. Chuck Schumer, crying Chuck. But now he's a proud, very proud Palestinian. It's becoming such a horrible and dangerous location that Ilhan Omar, she's also a very dishonest person and sure to get the hell out of our country. She shouldn't be here. She shouldn't be in our country. Gavin Newsom recently did a career-threatening, one of the worst interviews I've ever seen, where he said that he can't read a speech. He's incapable of reading a speech. He's a low IQ person. In Maine, they nominated a guy with a Nazi tattoo. But don't worry, Democrats. Word is that Platt, his replacement, he throws bottles at women. This guy throws bottles. This guy's another lunatic.
Aidan, what do we know about the speech? Anything about how it came together? And, I mean, was this just, again, another Trump campaign rally at the end of the day?
Well, I think we know that Trump himself didn't seem to be very happy with the speech. I mean, at multiple points, he interrupted himself to ask who wrote it. And why no one in the crowd was getting his jokes. And, you know,
they were bad.
Read the room.
People laughed at the jokes.
There were some delivery issues, though, I will say.
In defense of the speechwriter, he would stop repeatedly to riff in the middle of jokes, and then he'd deliver the punchline, and you have no idea what the setup was.
There could have been the one funny and appropriate joke that I'm not going to repeat on television right now was making fun of the age of lawmakers, and the delivery was completely botched.
Yeah, and the same thing with he had a joke about Barry Weiss and the leadership in Iran, which was kind of a funny joke, but it got completely lost in his delivery. So I do feel bad for the speechwriter would have to suffer that. But in a lot of ways, it felt like a hostage situation. There was like all these reporters who are trapped in Washington in the middle of the summer, being lured into Trump's old hotel by the president so they could sit for an hour and listen to him deliver a campaign rally and roast them. I mean, like, that's what I was thinking the entire time. This was like a grand trick that Trump had pulled off on the press. At least I was happy to see that the Correspondents Association put together that video which tried to impress upon Trump the importance of a free press. Right. I don't know if that's going to hold, at least beyond last night, but it was good to see that.
So, Vaughn, you mentioned in your prior set of remarks about these subpoenas that the president or the DOJ has issued to the New York Times about their coverage of Air Force One. That's what I want to talk about. What strikes me about these subpoenas is the timeline. If you go back and look at when these stories were published, they were published on July 8th and 9th just a few weeks ago. But the subpoena seeks information going back to January of this year. This doesn't feel like a narrow leak investigation, at least not to me. I want to play what the president said when he was asked about this just yesterday.
Do you support these type of subpoenas to journalists, or are you going to encourage the administration?
We're not after journalists. We're after leakers. We're after people that are cowards, people that are unpatriotic, people that are treasonous in many cases. And the way you find them is through the journalists.
So you think it's appropriate to subpoena family members of journalists to find out information?
I don't know what's appropriate, what's not.
What's your reaction to that?
You would know this from the DOJ that the New York Times subpoenas are the only subpoenas that we know about at this time.
Right.
And when you're going back to records dating back to January, you're talking about a trove of information, of records that this administration could seek to effectively try to prosecute journalists for the sources that they talk to, individuals inside of the government that felt compelled to go to journalists to have their stories shared and information be revealed because they believe that it's in the public interest to have it revealed. That is how journalism has long worked. And in 1971, the Supreme Court affirmed with the Pentagon Papers and the publishing of the Washington Post and the New York Times that unless the government is able to show that there is irreparable danger caused to the country and public interest, that the government effectively can't go and stop the publication of material. And so what we are watching here in the year of 2026 is an administration that has actively begun, forget the lawsuits, but the subpoenas, effectively gone to not just put fear and intimidation inside of news organizations, but also, importantly, officials, career employees, folks working within the government that, with their jobs on the line, if they were to be revealed, went and found journalists to share information. And what this administration is effectively saying to them is, do not do that. We are the ones that are going to be controlling the workflow of information. And when you have an admin that frankly cannot be trusted to share,
tell the truth,
and be transparent and tell the truth, it's a very difficult reality.
And at the end of the day, this isn't about like the navel gazing of journalists, right? That like, oh, we're so above everyone, so we should be able to, write whatever we want. It's about the people. It's about the American people. We are the only folks, people who talk to these sources who are trying to gather information. It's the only way they know what's going on in their government. Right. And so it's not about Donald Trump trying to it is about Donald Trump trying to silence journalists, trying to silence folks within the government who are looking at things that they're uncomfortable with or have a problem with. But it's also because they're trying to keep information from you guys at home.
To chill news gathering.
That is largely what is happening, is make sure that the American people don't hear what's going on. Let's throw up E6, Karen. Like, there's so many of the media targets that Donald Trump has been going after over and over and over again over the last 18 months. And Aiden, for me, and, I said this last night, I think you can joke about anything, but the jokes are only funny if Donald Trump didn't kick off the Associated Press out of the press pool last year. The jokes are funny if Donald Trump's DOJ didn't go knock on Tyler Pager's door and give him a subpoena for just reporting the facts when he got an award last night. The jokes would be funny if these attacks on journalists weren't actually leading to actual action.
Right. And I think, presidents have always had problems with the press. Every administration has had its troubles with reporters. They've had concerns about information they don't want leaked to reporters getting out to the public. This is entirely different. And the ways in which Donald Trump and his administration are cracking down on the press are totally unprecedented. I think a great example is what's happening at the Pentagon right now. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was in the audience last night. There is a war going on in Iran. The U.S. is engaged in a war in Iran, and we haven't had a major press briefing since May.
May 5th, yeah.
That is extraordinary. And on top of that, when he first took over at the Pentagon, he basically purged all real reporters from covering it. And so it's pervasive throughout this administration that you have officials and cabinet members who don't understand the value of the free press and actually go beyond that to punish information getting out to the American people.
Right.
And I do want to circle back to when we come back during the break, the conversation about the Pentagon, because there's more alarming news there.
Well, joining me now is another good friend of ours, Peter Baker, MS Now political analyst and chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. Trump was his charming self last night. Thanks to that clip, we got proof of that. But look, the reviews are in for his second chance at the Correspondents' Center speech. And much like his approval numbers, Peter, they are not great. So let's take a look at some of these headlines today. And what struck you about the night? And was it worth a second go-around?
Yeah, that's a good question, Alex. Look, I love the White House Correspondents Association. I've been a member almost continuously since 1996. That's almost 30 years. But last night was a mistake. Our mission as a correspondents association is to defend the First Amendment rights of White House reporters to report on the president. And I just don't think we advanced that mission last night. The New York Times decided actually almost 20 years ago that we don't go to this dinner anymore because we feel it's uncomfortable and inappropriate. And I think that was long before Trump came along. That's not about Trump specifically. It's just it felt wrong to our editors at that point. And I think last night showed why. I mean, let's just think about this week alone, Alex. Let's just walk through it for a second, if you don't mind. On Tuesday, President Trump's lawyers were in court in Miami in a lawsuit against the BBC, trying to punish the BBC for its coverage. On Wednesday, Trump's lawyers were in court in Tampa. I was there. I'm one of the defendants, along with my colleagues Sue Craig and Russ Boutner, in another lawsuit he's filed against the New York Times and Penguin Random House, because he doesn't like the coverage that he received. On Thursday, other colleagues of mine from the New York Times were in court in New York because the Trump Justice Department tried to subpoena 5 journalists, and including, by the way, 2 of the wives of those journalists and the mother of one of those journalists, in an effort to try to, as my executive editor put it, a brazen, naked attempt to intimidate the press. And then on Friday, the White House Correspondents Association invites President Trump, the same President Trump, to a dinner that's supposed to be about the First Amendment. This doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem in sync. And I think this is, just shows that this dinner has, long since passed its sell-by date, and we ought to be rethinking it.
It's extraordinary. The gloves are really off for him because you remember he never attended a White House Correspondents' dinner during his first term. So you have to wonder what's changed. He does seem completely unharnessed, if you will, during the second term on every level. But let's get back to what happened with the New York Times, because today, what you had mentioned there, the Times put out those 2 new headlines about the jet, including one about a credible Iran threat. And that's what prompted the plane swap during the NATO summit. What can you tell us about these new headlines?
Yeah, I think that, look, when the president switched planes in Ankara from the new plane donated by the nation of Qatar back to the original Air Force One, our reporters reported that there was a concern over security and that the new plane isn't, equipped with some of the same countermeasures that the traditional plane is. That's what got the president so mad that the Justice Department issued subpoenas against the writers of that story. Well, the new story tells us that there was actually a very specific threat that the government felt was credible from Iranian proxy groups that were targeting the president and the plane. That's not something that they had acknowledged publicly prior to this. And that gives us a little bit more understanding of what happened there in Ankara. And listen, this is why we have reporters. This is why we have news organizations to report on issues of importance to the public that the government may or may not want people to know. That's this system, and that's why I think these subpoenas were fortunately being withdrawn after a judge raked the Justice Department over the coals for violating policy and just handling things in a sloppy fashion. But that doesn't mean that's going to stop the Trump administration from continuing to find ways to try to intimidate or pressure the independent media.
Okay, well, let's stick with the Middle East on another important story. And we're going to talk about Trump's tentative nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia, because this agreement would allow American companies to run commercial nuclear power plants on Saudi soil, but only if the Arab kingdom agrees to normalize relations with Israel by joining the Abraham Accords. Now, Peter, the White House denies Israel requested this contingency, but if that didn't happen, why is the president insisting on it, and are the Saudis likely to comply?
Well, this is a really interesting story, and I'm glad you're focusing on it because, in fact, this was what the Biden administration tried to negotiate when he was in office. Actually, they were going to have a deal with the Saudis to normalize diplomatic relations with Israel. And in exchange, one of the things that Saudi Arabia would get out of it would be this civil nuclear cooperation agreement. Well, that negotiation was blown up on October 7th because of the Hamas attack on Israel. And what the president seemed to do at first this week was say, I'm going to give you the nuclear deal anyway. without any conditions with regard to Israel. And then a day later suddenly says, no, actually, there is the same condition that Biden was going to require, which is normalization of relations with Israel. Well, that's not something Saudi Arabia seems prepared to do. Saudi Arabia has said that they will not consider normalization with Israel until there is some sort of a credible path forward to resolve the issue with the Palestinians. And so suddenly this deal that they announced with great, hullabaloo this week is now, of course, sidelined because that's not where the Saudis are and doesn't look like they're going to be there. So it's odd and curious why the president went forward with an agreement knowing that he was going to put a condition on it that the Saudis wouldn't accept, or changing his mind and putting the condition on it after it was first signed.
So why does the White House want to do this deal at all? And how is it beneficial to the U.S.? Might it work as some sort of a deterrence to Iranian nuclear ambitions?
Well, that's why the Saudis are interested in it. The Saudis are interested for a couple of reasons, but one of which, of course, is to make sure that they can counter the Iranians. Secondly, they're looking to diversify their energy, plans, given the future of fossil fuels going forward. But it doesn't seem like the president got anything out of the deal until he suddenly then, imposed the Israel normalization condition on it. It seemed like he was just willing to give it to them. Now, there are people who will remind us that the Saudis are in business with some members of President Trump's family, including Jared Kushner, his son-in-law. That certainly raises suspicions on the part of some people about what's going on here, because it didn't seem like until he mentioned the Israel thing that there was anything in it for the United States, other than for perhaps some of our companies that do, do nuclear power. So, he hasn't really answered questions on this other than to say that he always intended to require normalization with Israel. But then why announce a deal that didn't actually have the Saudis agreeing to that?